As a creator, what do you do after you've made your greatest work? There's nowhere to go but down, right? That's certainly what a lot of people would say when you talk to them about the Mega Man franchise. Mega Man 2 was the most popular game in the series, and many would say it was the best. Mega Man is one of the IPs you commonly hear peaked early. It all went bad after 2, they say. I'm here to tell you, that's a giant load of crap. Mega Man 3 came out in September of 1990, almost 2 years after Mega Man 2. And this is actually one of the wider gaps between entries in this franchise while it was still in its heyday. It's easy to forget given the way Capcom tends to treat the Blue Bomber these days, but Mega Man was once a yearly franchise, and yearly franchises do have a reputation for being, let's say, samey. So one would hope the extra dev time on this entry would result in a more refined game, right? I definitely spoke of Mega Man 2 with a lot of admiration, but I also had my qualms for sure. After playing Mega Man 3, I can say that overall, this experience left me feeling a lot less conflicted. So what's changed this time? Well, for starters, the story for Mega Man 3 is more developed than the first 2 games. And by that I mean there's actually a story at all. A few months after the events of Mega Man 2, Dr. Wily claims to have reformed and is now working with Dr. Light on a new massive peacekeeping robot named Gamma. To power Gamma, 8 energy elements are needed, each one scattered on a distant, uncharted planet. To acquire these elements, the 2 doctors work together and create 8 new robot masters: Magnet Man, Hard Man, Top Man, Shadow Man, Spark Man, Snake Man, Gemini Man, and Needle Man. As the robot masters gather the elements, they end up going berserk, requiring Mega Man and his new companion, Rush, to head out to stop them and get the elements back, both aided and challenged by the mysterious Breakman. Of course, you wouldn't know any of this from playing the game itself, and while it was still pretty standard procedure to have the game's story premise only be outlined in the manual back then, Mega Man 3 lacks any intro cinematic, or even an attract mode. I sat on this title screen for like a full 3 minutes before I realized nothing was gonna happen. No story actually takes place in the game itself until you defeat the initial 8 Robot Masters, at which point Mega Man 3 actually breaks formula from the previous 2 games and offers more stages with returning Mega Man 2 bosses before moving on to Wily's castle as per usual. Oh yeah, Wily was just pretending to be a good guy, by the way. I'm sure you're shocked and dismayed by the revelation. Appalled. Confounded. Downright perturbed. Mega Man 3 would also see the introduction of a new major character. Just before development on Mega Man 3 began, designer Akira Kitamura would leave Capcom, but before doing so, the crew asked him if he had any new ideas for the next Mega Man game. Kitamura would propose the idea of a prototype version of Mega Man, leading to Proto Man, the secret identity of Mega Man 3's mysterious Breakman. Keiji Inafune would be the one to come up with the finalized design for the character, and he based Proto Man off of various animes he liked, with the main goal to make him look tougher than Mega Man. And I also have to imagine there was at least some Kamen Rider influence thrown in there too. The de facto older brother to Mega Man in role, Proto Man was the first creation of Dr. Light in his attempts at creating self-aware robots. And while that was a success, his solar reactor ended up faulty and would eventually cease to function. Fearing that having his reactor repaired would alter his personality, Proto Man fled from Dr. Light as far as he could. But his reactor would eventually wear out, and he would be found by Dr. Wily, who repaired and upgraded him, as well as gave him a sick visor and shield to hide his true identity. Of course, Wily also took this opportunity to reverse engineer Proto Man, and learn quite a lot about Dr. Light's methods. Knowledge he would use to create the Sniper Joe enemies we've been seeing throughout these games, a fact that Proto Man absolutely hates. Add the fact that he's always preceded by his iconic whistle, and I think that the goal of making a cooler Mega Man was reached. The ability to slide was added to Mega Man's repertoire, expanding movement options and allowing Mega Man to more easily dodge projectiles. Sliding would have been really great against some prior enemies, like the Yellow Devil from Mega Man 1, but it's not like Wily has a habit of reusing old concepts, right? But speaking of expanded movement options, another thing the crew asked Kitamura before he left Capcom was if there was anything he would have added to Mega Man 2 in retrospect. He said, "Turn the items into a dog." And the team said, "I bet, fam, we got you." So yeah, remember all the transportation items from Mega Man 2? Well, here you go. That's Rush. He's definitely an upgrade and definitely a very good boy. As opposed to the continuous weapon loop in Mega Man 1 and the web branching from the metal blades outward in Mega Man 2, Mega Man 3 has two distinct weapon loops, being the only game in the classic series to do this. Magnet Man is typically the best one to start with, then you move on to Hard Man, Top Man, Shadow Man, and Spark Man. The rest follow the loop of Snake Man, Gemini Man, and Needle Man in that order. And I've heard a lot of people say that the weapons in Mega Man 3 are all downgrades from 2's weapons across the board, but I can't say I agree. Mega Man 3's weapons are all, on the whole, less useful than 2's, sure, but that's just because they've actually been balanced this time? You can't just spam metal blades for the whole game, oh no. I'll concede that Hard Knuckle is just a worse Crash Bomb and that Spark Shock is a bit lacking. I personally would have replaced it with a Leaf Shield variant somehow, but the rest are all pretty grand. Gemini Laser bounces off of walls, but with the caveat that you can't fire a second shot until the first one is gone. Needle Cannon fires rapidly and through walls, Magnet Missiles can home in on enemies above and below you, and Search Snakes can travel along walls and ceilings. Top Spin is commonly derided as the worst weapon in the classic series, but in truth it's actually just very technical. It requires a high level of proficiency to use correctly without taking damage or wasting ammo, but once it's been mastered, it can be one of your most effective means of attack. But most of all, Shadow Blades are what the Metal Blades always should have been. They're still very light on ammo consumption, but they now can only travel a fixed distance, can only be fired in 5 directions and one at a time, and can only travel through certain types of walls. They serve roughly the same utility as Metal Blades, but without being nearly as easy to abuse, and call me crazy, I think that's an improvement. So in my last Mega Man video, when I said I didn't think Mega Man 2 was the best game in the classic series, yeah, it's because I think this one is. Not only is it a much friendlier game to first-time players thanks to stuff like the rebalanced weapons and the slide, but I also feel like it's just a better game. And honestly, I feel a little bit bad saying that. Not because I fear the wrath of the Mega Man 2 fans or what have you. No, I feel bad calling this one my favorite because reportedly the dev team had an absolutely miserable time making this one. See, after the success of Mega Man 2, Capcom made some changes. As mentioned before, Akira Kitamura, the original supervisor for the series, had left the company, and this caused development for Mega Man 3 to be much more stressful than Mega Man 2. According to Keiji Inafune, it was a project that, quote, didn't feel like a Mega Man title. More staff members would drop during the game's development, possibly due to this more stressful environment, and by the end, the game was released before the staff felt it was ready. Inafune has described Mega Man 3 as one of his least favorite games to work on, simply due to the awful work environment surrounding it. While this stressful development period thankfully isn't readily reflected in the final product, it does occasionally seep through. I somehow managed to soft-lock myself on Gemini Man's stage because I destroyed the wrong row of bubbles here and couldn't destroy the ones above me to make enough space to jump over this little bump. None of my weapons had any effect, so I was just forced to reset. So that's something that probably would have been caught with a bit more playtesting. And while I can't say it necessarily had anything to do with developer fatigue or whatever, I still have to ask, what happened to the Wily Castle levels in this game? These things are a complete joke this time. I don't mean that as strictly a bad thing. I've talked about enough NES sequels at this point to show that difficulty doesn't correlate to quality, but considering the difficulty of both previous and upcoming castles, I really have to assume this was all the influence of time crunch. Adding to that is a similar problem that was discussed with Mega Man 2 and ammo consumption, this time across an entire level as opposed to a boss fight. One of the new Doc Robot levels requires liberal use of the Rush Jet in order to cross a wide section with no floor. Weapon ammo is generously scattered throughout, allowing Mega Man to keep the Rush Jet active, but should you die during this sequence, the ammo, as per usual when losing a life, does not respawn, and the Rush Jet does not have nearly enough ammo to make it without those additional resources to pick up. So much like the situation with the accursed Boo Beam Trap, this forces a game over in order to reset ammo because there aren't any respawning enemies you can kill in order to slowly replenish your ammo. Some things never change, it seems, but at least you don't lose all your E-tanks this time. Speaking of E-Tanks, another improvement from the last game is that, yeah, any E-Tanks you haven't already used are retained upon a game over, and the player can stack up to 9 instead of just 4. To top it all off, E-Tanks also respawn upon leaving a level and thus can be farmed to collect as many as you want. So at the very least, getting a game over in the middle of the Wily levels doesn't have to be this big hullabaloo this time. Also, check this out, there are also enemies hounding you the whole time you're crossing this gap, but if you pause the game to use up an E-Tank, you can't re-engage the rush jet unless you have ground to stand on. I realized immediately after opening the menu what I had just done, and I could only watch helplessly as I resigned myself to the consequences of my own actions, falling to my death. Lovely. While I stand by the opinion that Mega Man 3 is better than 2, I can't help but feel for the developers here. To go from a labor of love to a mandatory burden is such a painful juxtaposition. But I mean, at least the game still turned out good, right? I think it would have been worse if the crew had a horrible time making it and the game still ended up being bad. At least this way their work wasn't a waste of time. And not that sales equate to quality, but Mega Man 3 is still one of the top sellers of the franchise at 1.1 million units. I am curious how it would have turned out had the team had more time and, frankly, more encouragement while working on Mega Man 3, but the end result is still my personal favorite of the classic series, and it made significant contributions to the franchise as a whole. And honestly, all of the Mega Man games at this point have had significant issues of some sort, proving that the series is at least consistent, if nothing else. So, no, it didn't all go bad after Mega Man 2. It all went bad after this one. In late 1988, Sega launched their new console, the Mega Drive, released as the Genesis in the US. A state-of-the-art machine that boasted 16-bit graphics, a more diverse color palette, and speedier processor than the systems currently available on the market. Around the same time, Hudson's PC Engine, aka TurboGrafx 16, would come out and show off similar features. Meanwhile, Nintendo was still dragging their feet with their 8-bit NES. It's understandable why Nintendo was a bit hesitant to kill the golden goose that was the NES. The console had single-handedly carried the company as a titan of the industry since its release. But Nintendo knew they would eventually need to catch up, especially as the Genesis started to close the gap between Sega and Nintendo in the West. The Super Famicom, or Super NES as it would be called outside of Japan, was at one point meant to truly live up to that name. Backwards compatibility with Famicom and NES games was planned as a basic feature, with 2 cartridge slots to accommodate for this. In fact, an entire layer of the Super NES architecture devoted to running NES games still exists in some form within the final product, although the feature would go unused. This was likely done to keep the console as affordable as possible. Even to this day, Nintendo has never been the type to prioritize fancy specs and snazzy features over general accessibility and affordability. So when the Super NES launched in November of 1990, the new machine would have to move on from the company's gigantic backlog of already successful games and somehow convince all of us that it could stand on its own with a brand new library of top-of-the-line 16-bit games. Fortunately for Nintendo, they apparently didn't need to do a lot of convincing. The initial shipment of 300,000 SNES units sold out within hours, re-establishing Nintendo as the lead company in video gaming. While the console would see 5 total games at launch once it was released in America the next year, the Japanese Super Famicom originally only launched with 2 games, Super Mario World and F-Zero. F-Zero is widely recognized as the progenitor of the futuristic racing genre. Produced by Shigeru Miyamoto and developed by a team of only 9, F-Zero set a new standard for the racing genre with its high speed, high difficulty, and extensive use of Mode 7 to show off the power of its 16-bit console. Mode 7 was Nintendo's big claim to fame with the SNES, and put simply, it's a special effects chip that allows for manipulation of the last background layer of the console's infrastructure, Layer 7, hence the name, using different means of scaling or rotating. The most recognizable effect of Mode 7 was mapping flat images onto a horizontal plane to create the illusion of 3 dimensions using an, in truth, still 2D image. This image can then be quickly rotated and tilted to give the visual impression of a horizon, making it perfect for the racing genre. Set in the year 2560, F-Zero is the brainchild of several bored multi-billionaires who wanted a new form of entertainment. Based on Formula 1 races with much more advanced technology, the F-Zero machines use anti-gravity tech to hover about a foot off the track. This combination of F1 racing and zero gravity is what gives the sport its name, F-Zero. This anti-gravity tech allows for race courses that more resemble roller coaster tracks. F-Zero machines are said to be able to effortlessly break the speed of sound, but in this entry seem to in fact max out around only 500 kilometers an hour. These factors culminated in a high-stakes way for billionaires to gamble and for racers to earn their fortunes. And while later games would greatly expand the roster of racers, the original game only had 4. The poster boy, Captain Falcon, in the Blue Falcon, Dr. Stewart in the Golden Fox, Pico in the Wild Goose, and Samurai Goro in the Fire Stingray. The music in F-Zero is nothing short of audio bliss, helped chiefly by the new technology of the Super Famicom. Its Sony-developed sound chip is heralded as one of the best proprietary console music generators ever made. Every track, save for Big Blue, was composed by Yumiko Kanki, and these tunes are exactly the high-energy soundtrack a futuristic racer needs. Mute City is a jazzy blast, and Big Blue is bombastic as hell, and while these two are the most iconic tracks in the series overall, the rest of the songs have their own distinct feel and charm. Deathwind evokes its name perfectly with foreboding, aberrant tones. And for being on a completely desolate planet, Silence is shockingly upbeat and gives a disco vibe of all things. Controls are pretty standard for a racing game, all things considered. You steer, accelerate, brake, and boost, but since this racing game uses hover cars, F-Zero also includes the ability to tilt your vehicle. This is your drift mechanic, and is critical for the narrow turns you'll encounter. And while there is a sparse amount of control, the responsiveness is incredible, which is great because this game will throw a lot of hazards at you. Landmines, magnetic strips, other vehicles that aren't racers but still act to get in your way for some reason, so on and so forth. Each vehicle also has an energy meter, which depletes when colliding with other vehicles, the sides of the track, or hazards such as landmines. Lose all your energy, and the race ends. Much like actual racetracks, though, there are pit areas to help you recharge lost energy. Racers also receive a 4-second speed boost upon completing each lap, of which 3 can be stockpiled at a time. Each race is a 5-lap course in which the player must complete their lap while placing a minimum spot in the race, or else they are disqualified, with the required placement becoming stricter with each lap. If the player can't finish the race in at least 3rd place, they lose. The tracks are divided into 3 different leagues of 4 increasing difficulties, and they include different takes on a few courses, like Mute City and Port Town. So, this game is pretty hard, bordering on unfair in all honesty. Super Mario Kart is more frustrating overall thanks to the addition of items and more general chaos, but the rest of the unfair racing gimmicks kinda started with F-Zero. The AI will hunt you down with impunity and will always be just behind you should you manage to pass them. You will never lap these guys, not even if you save up and chain your speed boosts. And whenever an AI-controlled vehicle hits you, their speed loss is laughable, but you become a pinball with an abrupt loss of control, which can send you into another hazard or off the course entirely. While the game does give you a few extra lives with which to retry courses, don't expect to master these courses on the first try, especially on the higher difficulties. Other than the Grand Prix mode, there is a practice mode to test out courses and build muscle memory, but sadly, there is no multiplayer mode in this game. Yeah, the racing game. You know, the genre that's inherently about competing with other people doesn't let you play with other people. This very apparent lack of content is the biggest detriment to F-Zero, because while the core gameplay and level design are great, there just isn't a whole lot to do in this game. Unfortunately, F-Zero really just comes off like a fancied-up tech demo to show off the Super Nintendo's Mode 7. And this was likely born of the fact that Super Mario World would use Mode 7 a lot more sparingly and subtly, and Nintendo really wanted to enter the ring with both fists swinging. So, despite the lack of content, F-Zero showed the power of the Super Famicom with crisp graphics and stellar music, and established many of the design philosophies for numerous other racing series, such as Mario Kart, Daytona USA, and Wipeout. And with a solid 2.8 million in sales, it was definitely enough for work to start on future entries eventually. While I would recommend F-Zero X or GX for gameplay that actually lasts, if you wanted to see where the series began, F-Zero does still hold up for the little while it sticks around anyway. The now-established trio of Shigeru Miyamoto, Takashi Tezuka, and Koji Kondo returned with others from Mario 3 to bring Mario to the 16-bit era, with what seemed like, at the time, no restrictions on mechanics or graphics. In fact, to get used to the unfamiliar tools of the Super Famicom, the team started by simply porting Mario 3 with updated colors and sprites. But when the team felt disillusioned by just repackaging a previous game, it was decided to make a brand new adventure. Super Mario World, alternatively titled Super Mario Bros. 4, was the other launch title for the Super Famicom, released on November 21st, 1990. As with most games of the era, the story's premise is only found in the instruction manual, but Mario World is naturally a direct sequel to Mario 3, with Mario, Luigi, and Princess Peach on vacation after saving the Mushroom Kingdom. While in Dinosaur Land, Princess Peach is kidnapped by Bowser yet again, and as the brothers search for her, they come across a giant egg in a forest. It hatches, revealing Yoshi, who somehow knows that Bowser and the Koopalings have captured all of his friends. I guess the egg was more of a cage than, like, a literal egg. The trio then rushes across Dinosaur Land's 7 initial worlds, beating the Koopalings and eventually Bowser himself to save all the kidnapped Yoshis and Princess Peach. With the advent of new hardware came a bunch of improvements to the Mario formula. This is the first game in the series to have a save feature, with the opportunity to save appearing every time the player reaches some major milestone. No longer being required to beat the whole game in one sitting really opens up the ability to explore and experiment. Game overs return you to the most recent save with 5 lives, so your lives are infinite in a sense, and warp zones and whistles have understandably been retired. Mario World also introduces the spin jump to Mario's repertoire, allowing him to, well, spin while jumping. The force of the spin allows Mario to jump on hazardous enemies such as Spinies without taking damage, and to break blocks from above. But it also amplifies other power-ups. Having a Fire Flower active causes Mario to hurl fireballs in both directions, and having a Cape Feather active gives Mario the Cape Spin for some extra reach. In contrast to how Mario 3 allowed you to store a horde of power-ups, World instead keeps only your most recently acquired power-up in a box at the top of the screen. This item can be used manually at any time during a level by pressing Select, or is used automatically whenever Mario takes damage. A good handful of the power-ups from Mario 3 didn't make the cut this time, such as the frog and hammer suits, but there are some new tools in exchange. The aforementioned Cape Feather is a much more versatile flight power-up than both the Raccoon Leaf or Tanuki suit, but requires a bit more practice and skill to use effectively. And the Power Balloon makes you swell up and float for a limited time, which is kind of just flying but slower, really. Most notably, though, Mario World also gave us Yoshi, arguably the biggest impact the game had on the franchise, and that's saying something. Presumably inspired by Miyamoto's love of horseback riding, the idea of Mario having a reptilian steed was originally pitched for the first Super Mario Bros., but the limited tech of the Famicom meant the team was unable to have Yoshi act the way Miyamoto wanted. So Nintendo sat on the idea of a dinosaur companion for the time being, until it was decided that Super Mario World would take place in Dinosaur Land. And with that as the backdrop, Tezuka pushed to make this potential partner a reality. At first conceptualized as a crocodile, Yoshi was redesigned to be cuter to better fit into the Mario world. Much like a horse, Yoshi can be ridden for easier movement, but also an extra hit point, and Mario's most infamous betrayal.
Discarded at the goal. Turns out that Mario is an asshole.
But that's not all. Much like a frog or chameleon, Yoshi can also use his tongue to grab enemies and pop them in his mouth. Most enemies will just be swallowed whole, but Koopa shells in particular grant Yoshi different effects depending on their color. Red shells let Yoshi spit fireballs, yellow shells let Yoshi create damaging bursts of sand whenever he lands, and blue shells give Yoshi wings, adding a third flight power-up to this game. And this one is the most useful of them all. Red, yellow, and blue Yoshis found in the bonus Star World levels have these abilities innately, and are still granted other abilities from each shell. For example, a red Yoshi eating a blue shell will be able to spit fire and fly. Flashing shells grant all abilities to any Yoshi, but green shells give no extra abilities, and instead are just simply thrown along the ground like Mario normally would. As opposed to the separate maps of Mario 3, the levels in Mario World all take place on one large interconnected world map, leading to a less linear and more organic sense of progression. The worlds themselves feel more natural than Mario 3 as well, opting for fun food-based names for your typical level inspirations like Grassland, Cave, Mountain, and Haunted Forest. In addition, much more than traditional Mario levels populate Dinosaur Land. Ghost houses are designed to trick the player with puzzles and traps. Switch palaces permanently turn any like-colored outlines into solid blocks. Warp pipes send you to different parts of the map as per usual. And by finding secret exits in certain levels, you might just find a path or two to the Star World and the special zone beyond that. Yeah, levels can now have multiple exit routes, so they might take a few playthroughs to find the exit needed for a secret route. Thankfully, the game marks these levels in red on the map to let the player know which levels have multiple paths. The Forest of Illusion in particular won't let you progress without finding the secret exits, as regular paths just send you in aimless circles. The Secret Zone is perfect for those missing the challenge of the older games, with each stage having a distinct gimmick and pattern to discover and overcome. As has been the pattern, each subsequent Mario game, lost levels notwithstanding, has gotten more accessible, and World is no exception. But that doesn't mean there's a lack of difficulty. It just means the platforming is merely tricky as opposed to frustrating or downright sadistic. It shouldn't come as a shock to anyone to hear me say that Super Mario World is the most iconic game of the Super NES. It was bundled with the system on launch, and is the best-selling game for the system at 20.61 million units across all its various re-releases. And this makes it the 5th highest-selling entry overall for the Super Mario series. It's not even a stretch to believe this is the best Mario game of all time, something I alluded to back in my look at Mario 3. The craziest thing about this is that Miyamoto himself, despite this being his favorite Mario game, has publicly stated that he feels this game was rushed out the door in order to compete with Sega, and that he feels it's in many ways incomplete. Honestly, could have fooled me. Nothing about this game feels undercooked, aside from a rare bug or two. Mario games usually give me a world of trouble, but I feel right at home with this one. Maybe if there was more time, the game would have felt more distinct than Mario 3, like the world of difference between Mario 1 and Mario 3, but for all we know, it also could have turned out disastrous. Mario World didn't take a whole lot of risks in terms of the traditional Mario formula, but with a new console generation, I think it's important that the dev team nailed the basics down before branching out again, which they would indeed do in good time. All that aside, Super Mario World is a cornerstone of gaming, showing off the power of an exciting new generation of hardware with more finesse than the glorified Mode 7 showcase that was F-Zero. 3 decades later, that finesse still holds true. This game is a timeless wonder, still worth playing to this day, and safe to say, will still be worth playing in another 3 decades.